Welcome to Catholic Truths, where we try to dispel falsities, lies, and misnomers about the Catholic Church. Today we're going to be discussing the Pope. Yes, the Pope. There's always a lot of false information going around about the Pope, and sometimes there's scandals involved, and so people get the bad views or wrong ideas of what the Pope actually is. So again, I've got my trusty cue cards, so forgive me if I'm reading from them and whatnot. I don't have everything memorized. So one thing to understand about the Catholic Church is, unlike a lot of Protestant churches, the Catholic Church has a hierarchy. I'm going to go through these really briefly, the different rankings of the Catholic Church. You have the deacon. That is the lowest ordained position. And there's two types of deacons. The first is a transitional deacon, and this is a seminarian that's actually studying to become a priest. You also have a permanent deacon, and he can be married, and he assists a priest by performing some of the sacraments, as do the temporary priests or the transitional deacons. Next rank up would be a priest. Now, I say rank, that doesn't necessarily mean rank, because a permanent deacon isn't going to become a priest. But a priest is an ordained minister who can administer most of the sacraments, including the Eucharist, baptism, and marriage. He can be with a particular religious order or committed to serving a congregation. So this is why you'll see priests sometimes that are always constantly at a specific congregation. You sometimes see priests that move around. Okay, next up you have bishops. Like a priest, he is ordained to this station. He is a teacher of church doctrine, a priest of sacred worship, and a minister of church government. And the idea of church government, of course, sometimes brings up a whole nother question, and this is even your local non-denominational church is going to have some form of internal government, so that's all that means. Then you have an archbishop. Now, a bishop, he's still a bishop, but he is a bishop of a main or metropolitan diocese, also called an archdiocese. A cardinal can concurrently hold the title, so a cardinal can both be a bishop and can be an archbishop and a cardinal. Okay, and that brings us to the next one, a cardinal. A cardinal is appointed by the Pope himself. There are 178 cardinals worldwide, and they make up the College of Cardinals. As a body, it advises the Pope, and on his death, it elects a new Pope. So that's the role of the cardinals. And briefly, I mean, there's a lot more to it. But of course, then we have the Pope. He is the head of the church. He is based at the Vatican. The Pope is infallible in defining matters of faith and morals. And therein raises some questions right there. So, where does the idea of the Pope come from? Well, the idea is from ordained positions being generational. In other words, a bishop will ordain a priest who will become a bishop eventually, who will then ordain a priest, and it's a cyclic nature. And so this dates back to the time of the apostles, who ordained the first bishops, and people also view the apostles themselves as bishops. So the best way to look at it is Jesus gave authority to the apostles. They gave authority to bishops, who then gave authority to priests, and then it became there's no more apostles. So eventually priests would replace bishops that have died away or retired, and so they get ordained into becoming bishops, and therefore they also received the direct line from that. So even today, all the bishops and priests have a direct lineage all the way back to the apostles. Okay, so Matthew 16:15 through 19 says, "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." And it continues on a little bit more. So what does that scripture mean? Because you'll have people read this and they'll say, "Oh, there's a pope. We should have a pope." You'll have others say, "That's not what that means." Well, historically, and we can look at this historically and linguistically and stuff, Peter was not actually being called Peter at this point in time. It tells us Simon Peter at the first part of the verse because he that's how we're recognizing him. These are written after the events, obviously. But he calls him Simon Peter. It refers to him as Simon Peter, but when Jesus responds to him, he says, "You are Simon, son of Jonah." So his name is actually still Simon during this point in time. He then gives Peter, or Simon, the name of Peter. He says, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church." And the Protestant view of this is they will say, he says, "You are Peter, but upon this rock," referring to himself, "I will build my church." That doesn't make sense linguistically. Now, the counter-argument to this is, Peter means rock, Petros. His name is Petros, but more specifically in the Greek, it means little rock, or a pebble. The word when Jesus says, "and upon this rock," is Petra, which is just a rock, you know, something more foundational. But we get into the issue of the reason why Jesus would have called him Petros, not Petras, is because you have masculine and feminine. In English, we don't really have this, so you would not call Peter a female rock. So he used the masculine term, which can be translated. But we have to remember, Jesus wasn't speaking to the apostles in Greek. He was speaking mostly either in Hebrew or Aramaic, both which share very similar vocabularies and just the way the alphabet and everything. So literally, in the original language Jesus would have been speaking to them, he said, "You are rock, and on this rock I will build my church." There was no Petros, Petros. It was just rock and rock. So literally, he says, "You are a rock. You are the rock. You are rock. On this rock I will build my church." That's literally what he is saying. And then he gives the keys of heaven to Peter, and this was also interpreted a lot of times as saying, no, he gave them to everybody, but that's only if you interpret the previous part of it to everybody. But this actually sets up Peter as the vicar of Christ. In other words, what eventually becomes known as the Pope. Historically, the name Pope didn't show up until, you know, later, but the position was there. He's the Bishop of Rome, is what he was referred to. So the next big question that always comes up is, what is papal infallibility? Ooh, does this mean Peter, you know, the Pope is perfect? Well, it does not mean that the Pope is sinless, nor does it mean that everything the Pope says is true. We got to get that out of there. Everyone thinks that Catholics believe the Pope is a perfect human. He is not. He is just as much as a sinner as you and me, probably a little better at not going around and doing certain sins, but he's still a sinner nonetheless. The Pope, believe it or not, actually goes to confession. So you may ask, who does the Pope confess to? He can go to any priest he wants to. So that's how that works. Papal infallibility is the authority of the Pope on church teachings. This means that the Holy Spirit prevents the Pope from officially teaching error. Something referred to as ex cathedra, from the chair, must be invoked for it to be infallible. Now, ever since ex cathedra has been defined, it's only ever been used twice. The first time itself, it was used on itself to explain that it has to be spoken in ex cathedra. It was used to define it. And it was used one other time since then, and I apologize, I don't actually remember what the case was for that, but it's nothing too huge today, obviously. But what this means is you can disagree with the Pope. It's the difference between actions and teachings. Does not mean a Pope will not neglect church teaching stuff. What this means is you may have a Pope that says communism is the greatest thing in the world. Well, okay, I don't agree with that, and I don't. And that's perfectly fine, because that's not church teaching. Now, if he says Mary is the mother of God, oh, I don't agree with that, well, then you're in the wrong, because that is church teaching and stuff. Things like that. That's what that's referring to. But I speak about disagreements with the Pope and stuff. Well, this brings up our current Pope, Pope Francis. A lot of people disagree with this man, but he is our current Pope. He replaced Pope Benedict XVI after he retired. The big thing with Pope Francis is he's raised a lot of controversy. A lot of it, he's against capitalism. He's released some very vague documentations that people are interpreting different ways. But we have to remember this. He has not officially taught church heresies, or he has not taught anything that is a violation of, church law. One thing that someone pointed out to me the other day was, how do we define these vague things that Pope Francis is putting out? Well, it's kind of a consensus, and it's a historical viewpoint that if something vague is given out, to always fall back to the traditional church teachings. So we have this thing that came out by Pope Francis called Amor Laetitia, I believe that's how it's pronounced, and it has questioned whether divorcees should be allowed to receive the Eucharist. And, it's divided a lot of people in the church and stuff. They're saying, oh, the Pope has officially said that, if you're divorced, not annulled, but just flat out divorced, or remarried in that sense, you can still get the Eucharist. Well, this violates church teaching that's already been set in place. And so, because of the vague wording, though, people are interpreting it this way. However, if you just look at traditional teachings and apply it to this document, you already know the answer. They're not allowed to get it. So this has caused a lot of controversy and stuff. But one thing we must remember is to always respect the office and the authority of the Pope. We may not like a person, but we still need to respect them. Okay, well, that's it about the Pope. This is just a brief overview of papal infallibility and the Pope in general. Next week, we'll be discovering saints. Not discovering, I apologize. We'll be discussing saints. Well, maybe we will be discovering saints. I mean, we'll probably talk about a few. I want to thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. Follow me on Twitter. I should have the link in the description below, but if you can't find the link, it's Catholic_truths, or at Catholic_truths. Be sure to visit our Amino. It's the Catholics community. All you have to do is, if you download the app, is type in Catholics in the search bar, and we should pop right up. If you type in Christianity, we're the second or third people to pop up too. But the links for all these are in the description below. I want to thank you, and I'll see you next week.